Welcome to Cancer Lesson 1.4. How can we identify a novel carcinogen? The goals of this lesson are to explore the concept of correlation versus causation in relation to carcinogens, and to introduce challenges to determining causes of cancer. At the end of the lesson, the student should be able to discuss Hill's postulates and compare and contrast Hill's postulates with Koch's postulates, and explain the limitations of Hill's postulates with respect to establishing causation as opposed to correlation. We will achieve these goals by engaging in a Socratic discussion and a jigsaw activity on Hill's postulates. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the following key scientific concepts that will be presented throughout the lesson: the difference between correlation and causation, and what kind of study designs reveal one or the other. The purpose of Koch's postulates and the fact that these postulates can prove causality, but not in humans. The fact that Hill's postulates are an alternative to Koch's postulates and can support causality in humans but cannot prove it. And how Hill's postulates were used to propose a causative relationship between smoking and cancer. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual, or lesson plan, provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure. And the student workbook provides additional explanation for students. Be sure to print the lesson worksheet on Hill's postulates and the homework reading on the case against smoking. The key point of the do now is that whereas the Ames test can show that a substance can actually cause mutations in bacteria, we cannot test for suspected human carcinogens in the same way because this would require us to give the suspected carcinogen to humans in an attempt to induce cancer. In the do now, students should be able to articulate that the Ames test can positively identify that a suspected carcinogen can cause cancer, whereas in order to prove that HPV causes cervical cancer, they would need to use HPV to cause cancer in humans. The key points of the discussion include the following. Koch's postulates establish causation but have limitations. Namely, they cannot be used to prove a substance causes cancer in humans. An alternative method used in humans is to use Hill's postulates. These are a series of tests to establish that a suspected carcinogen is correlated with cancer, but they cannot prove causality. First, we introduce how Robert Koch actually treated healthy cows with the anthrax bacterium to prove that it causes disease. Then we articulate all the characteristics of Koch's postulates, the most important one being that to prove causation, the pure infectious agent must be shown to cause disease. Switching our attention to cancer, we reinforce that proving causation in humans, as Koch's postulates demand, is impossible. Next, we introduce the types of epidemiological studies that can be used to establish causation versus correlation, and what are the pros and cons of each kind. Then we introduce Bradford Hill, who devised a series of tests that independently show that a substance is correlated with cancer. Each of Hill's postulates or tests independently establishes correlation by eliminating alternative explanations for the results. Together, they can make a strong case that the suspected carcinogen is associated with cancer. But none of them, either alone or together, can prove causation. The best we can do is make a strong argument for causation. Next, we take a closer look at the 9 Hill's postulates, and then apply these postulates to the question of the relationship between cigarette smoking and cancer. The key point of the activity is to evaluate evidence for whether causality can be established between a suspected carcinogen and type of cancer. We'll get there with a jigsaw activity on evaluating Hill's postulates. In the jigsaw activity, students will work in groups of 3, and each group will examine one of the 9 Hill's postulates for each of 4 different relationships. They will then determine whether the evidence supplied is sufficient to satisfy that postulate and try to come up with an alternate explanation for the results that would argue against that postulate being satisfied. After all the groups have finished, go over all the relationships to determine whether the weight of evidence for the relationship is sufficient to support causality, or whether any of their alternate explanations, either singly or together, would be sufficient to argue against it. The key points of the wrap-up are that it is impossible to prove a substance causes cancer in humans, and that this is a major problem with identifying carcinogens, since their actions are critically dependent on dose and potency that might differ from their actions in experiments in animal cells or in bacteria. We wrap up the activity by asking, from the evidence the students have just discussed, what relationships do they believe are causative? This leads to a discussion of some of the challenges of causality. Hill's postulates cannot prove causality no matter how many postulates are supported. And this leads us to the homework, which is reading a chapter from The Emperor of All Maladies that describes how tobacco companies exploited the challenges of proving causality to avoid regulation. One of the most common questions students ask is, which of Hill's postulates is the most important? There is no single most important postulate. Rather, the more postulates met, the less likelihood of alternative causal explanations. Another question students may ask is, if it is impossible to prove causality in humans using carcinogens, how can we definitively say that smoking causes lung cancer? This is a great question that is important to consider. As the students will read in their homework, the evidence to support a causal relationship between smoking and cancer is sufficient enough to infer a causal relationship. Furthermore, public health action is often strongly justified before stringently meeting causal criteria. At the end of the lesson, collect the lesson worksheets to assess how students weigh the evidence for or against causal relationships by using Hill's postulates. In this lesson, we learned how to identify carcinogens. In the next lesson, students will learn how to quantify the risk that exposure to carcinogens poses to developing cancer. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members and we'll be happy to help you.